So, at our last screencast, we're beginning to see some of the American victories that started to happen along the Canadian border in the War of 1812. Now, at the same time, in the South, we also began to see hostilities erupt from the Native Americans down there, especially from the Creek Indians, who started to attack the American settlers who continued to push further into their territory. And so the Creek attacked Fort Mims on the Alabama River. And with that, many of those who were in the fort, protecting the fort, were killed. And so Tennessee Militia Commander Andrew Jackson takes about 2,000 volunteers to attack the Creek, and they're finally able to defeat them along the Tallapoosa River in Alabama, known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And with the end of that battle, we also find the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ended the Creek War officially and forced the Native Americans to give up millions of acres of their territory to the United States. This is also where Andrew Jackson is starting to make a name for himself, really becoming a war hero, and this is going to add to his popularity later on when Jackson decides to run for president. Now, in the spring of 1814, so in April of 1814, the British were finally able to defeat France and Napoleon. And because of that, they were able to send more troops here to the Americas. So even though the U.S. was starting to fare some victories along Canada and now in the South against the Native Americans, the British now began to send reinforcements. And with these new reinforcements, the British attacked the East Coast and attacked Washington, D.C. And this is where Washington, D.C. is actually destroyed. The White House was burned. The Capitol building was also burned. So many of these historic monuments that had been created that were kind of the icons of the new nation were now destroyed by the British. And this was a harsh blow to the Americans, especially morally, to watch Washington, D.C. burn. President Madison and everyone else in the House had to then flee and live out the rest of his term living somewhere else. This is the story where President's wife, Dolly Madison, right? She doesn't leave the White House until she grabs a very famous painting of George Washington and tries to save that painting from the fire. After that, it's going to take years before the White House is then going to be rebuilt. It's not going to be until President Monroe, I think it is, that they're going to be able to actually move back into the White House after it's been reconstructed and rebuilt. And if you go to the White House today and take these special tours, you can still see that there's parts of the White House where you still see the marks of the fire. You can see where it's black there, where you still see the remnants of that fire during the War of 1812. From Washington, the British continued to move north and actually went into Baltimore, Maryland, and attacked Fort McHenry. The people in Fort McHenry, though, refused to surrender, so the fort was actually shelled for 25 hours straight. This is where lawyer Francis Scott Key, right, looked on from a ship outside the port along the water, and the next morning, through all of the smoke, noticed that the flag was still flying in Fort McHenry, and that's what's going to inspire him to write the Star-Spangled Banner that eventually in 1931 is adopted as our national anthem. Despite the British forces, because of the fact that at Fort McHenry, after the shelling, the Americans refused to surrender. The British eventually retreated. They'll see that the Americans are still refusing to surrender. Down in the Battle of New Orleans, this is considered our final battle of the War of 1812 between General Andrew Jackson against a combined British and infantry force. And they are eventually forced to retreat. And this victory really boosted American morale to be able to drive the British away, both on land and water. And the Battle of New Orleans is considered the final battle of the War of 1812. Though technically, the Battle of New Orleans actually happened after the War of 1812 was officially over, because the battle happened in January, but the Treaty of Ghent, which actually ended the war, was signed on December 24th of 1814. However, word had not reached the United States yet that the war had actually ended, and so that's why the Battle of New Orleans happened. Simultaneously, the Federalists who were protesting this war still actually had decided to meet in Hartford as a Hartford Convention to openly oppose and protest the war. But by the time that they all got there to do this, the war had also ended as well. So they actually ended up looking like idiots because of the fact that they came to protest a war that was over. And with the death of Alexander Hamilton, and now with this event, this begins to really lose support for the Federalist Party, and we begin to see the decline of the Federalist Party after that. So through the Treaty of Ghent, it didn't really establish a clear victor for the war. All it did was pretty much just end the war. It ended the hostilities, just the conflict, because there was no side that was declared winner or loser at all. All it did was pretty much just return things to the way it was before the war started, because any conquered territory that either side had gained was returned to their owner. It didn't really resolve any issues regarding trade and border disputes that had been long unresolved before. It didn't address that either. So the Treaty of Ghent pretty much just set things back to the way that they were, right? Back to the status quo, where the war was over, the conflict had ended, and everything went back to the way it was before the war started. Despite that being how the war ended, it did have an impact here at home. There was an increased sense of patriotism here that we were able to withstand the British forces again. That's why the War of 1812 is sometimes considered a second war of independence. It also did a lot of boosting for our manufacturing trade because of the war, since a lot of trading has stopped during the war. Now there was a boosted sense of manufacturing, and it started to make a lot of money for the US. And also Native American resistance began to weaken after the War of 1812. We begin to see that the Native American tribes that were living in these territories, their resistance against these American settlers start to weaken now after the War of 1812. So there were some major effects at home from this war. So with this, that pretty much just ends the War of 1812 through the Treaty of Ghent, the Battle of New Orleans being the final battle of the war, even though it happened technically afterwards. But this is definitely going to send the country into a new sense of victory, a new sense of pride in the country, a new sense of nationalism, and a new sense of economic and industrial boom that we'll see is going to affect the way that the country grows now after the War of 1812.